After my marriage ended, I was in a tough spot financially. I was working part-time as a server, and I had an apartment that I couldn't afford. It wasn't fancy or anything, but I didn't make enough to keep up with the rent anyway. I started using Tinder to meet new people around that time. I had used it in the past. In fact, that's how I met my first husband. I was at home swiping on the app one evening, and nobody really caught my eye. Maybe I was being too picky, or maybe I wasn't over my ex yet. After a while, though, an interesting profile came up. His name was Jay, and he was actually a few years younger than me. Normally, I'm interested in older guys. Not too much older, but I'd never dated anyone younger before. I cycled through each of his pictures a few times. They showed him in different locations. One was a white sand beach, another was in New York City. There was even one image of Jay where it looked like he was in front of a private jet. I know I sound shallow, but that's the truth about what made him stand out. That wasn't the only reason I was interested. It was just what made him stand out initially. I swiped right on Jay, which was the only right swipe I had done so far. Then I put my phone away and went to bed. When I woke up the next morning, I opened my phone and saw that I had a match on Tinder. I knew it was Jay because that's the only one I had accepted. I opened my messages and saw that he had contacted me already. All he said was hi. That's a bit of a pet peeve of mine. If you're going to contact me, then try to say a little more than that. I let it slide this time though, and we started to have a conversation. After no more than 5 or 10 messages each way, Jay asked me out on a date. I accepted, and we made plans for the following Friday night. We went out to a really nice restaurant, way fancier than what I would have suggested. He was a slightly awkward guy. I can't really put my finger on why. We had an alright conversation, but there were more uncomfortable silences than I'm used to. It was a first date though, and first dates can be awkward. When the bill came, I was a little nervous that Jay would want to split the cost for the night. I didn't know how much it would be, but I knew that I couldn't afford it. That's why I was relieved when Jay grabbed the bill from the table, without hesitation. After that, we parted ways, and I headed home on the bus. Jay and I went out another few times over the following weeks. Like before, we always had a pretty good time. There was something off about him though. It was like he was trying too hard to impress me. It was clear that he had money, and he wasn't afraid to spend it on me. Things were getting more and more extravagant. He took me on a river cruise on the weekend that must have been at least a few $1,000s total. All that for a woman who wasn't even his girlfriend yet. I don't mean to sound unappreciative, but it did seem like a bit of a red flag. Things came to a head when Jay texted me and invited me on a trip to Mexico. Although tempting, I wasn't ready to make that kind of step. I felt bad, but I broke things off with him through text message. After that, my phone rang. It was Jay. I answered it and was immediately bombarded with the most vile, hate-filled insults I'd ever heard. This guy was mad. I'd never seen this side of him before. While we were dating, Jay was a really polite and shy type of guy. I held the phone up to my ear for a minute or two, and the screaming didn't stop, so I eventually hung up the phone and turned it off. I was scared. I didn't know what this guy was capable of. He also knew where I lived because he dropped me off at my apartment once or twice before. The next morning, I turned on my phone, and there were dozens of missed calls and tons of messages from Jay. I don't remember the exact content of the messages, but they were filled with the same insults as before. I didn't reply for the next few days, but eventually, I decided to call him and try to smooth things over. He picked up the phone and started screaming at me like before. I tried to calm him down for a minute or so, but it was useless. He even said that I had to pay him back for all the dates we'd been on. I was in no position financially to do that, so I hung up again. I went to work the next night. I was working nights as a server at the time, and my mind was on Jay the whole evening. I was worried that he'd come for me for the money, or worse. I got off at around 1 a.m. and took the bus home. When I got to my front door, my heart sank. The door was wide open. I took a cautious step inside, and as soon as I did, I knew someone had been there. My mind went immediately to Jay. I called out hello, but there was no response. I walked through the place, fear flowing through my body. When I got to my bedroom, I noticed something on my bed. It was a piece of paper. I picked it up and turned it over. There was a message written on it that said, "You're dead." That was enough. I ran out of there and didn't go back. I went to my friend's place that night and called the police. They were able to arrest Jay with my testimony, as well as the evidence that they were able to gather from my apartment. After the police interrogated Jay, they found out that he was flat broke and that he was paying for our dates with borrowed money on several credit cards. I was really confused about that for a while, but when I saw a documentary on Netflix, it started to make sense. In the documentary, a guy used Tinder to sweep women off their feet with expensive gifts and dates. Then he would trick them into paying him back by borrowing money, and then he would promise to pay them back, but never would. My relationship with Jay never got that far, but I suspect it was leading there. That would explain why he wanted me to pay him back. After that, I never heard from him again, and I'm more careful about who I meet online. This reminds me of an old saying that my grandfather used to use. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is. I worked at a small ice cream shop when I was in my early 20s. That's where I met one of my best friends. Her name was Melanie, and she was 1 year younger than me. I was kind of like a big sister to her. We always tried to have our shifts together, which were usually in the evenings, since the more senior workers got the day shifts. The place had a few busy periods throughout the night, usually when the movie ends. There was a large movie theater nearby, and that was the main source of customers. We would use that time to gossip and discuss our personal lives. I had a steady boyfriend at the time, and we'd been together since high school, so I didn't have any experience with dating apps. Melanie, on the other hand, was on several different apps. She was around 5'8", with short blonde hair and slightly plus-sized. She used Tinder mostly, and would often show me her matches and the cringy openers that they would send her. We were standing behind the counter at the shop, huddled around her phone giggling. She then showed me a new match of hers and the conversation that they'd started. His name was Troy, and he was 27 years old. Troy had longish black hair, a short beard, and glasses. He was actually really good looking, almost like a model. My first impression was that it might be fake, but I didn't want to be a downer, so I kept my mouth shut. Melanie then told me that they were planning to go on their first date the following night. I wished her luck, then she put away her phone, and we finished our shift for the night. I gave her a call the following night at around 11 p.m. to see how the date went. She didn't answer, which I took as a good sign, and then I went to bed. Melanie and I had a shift together the next night, and I was excited to find out how the date went. When I got to work, though, Melanie was nowhere to be found. It was not like her to be late, so I called her phone, but there was no answer. I didn't have her parents' number, so I really didn't know what to do. I waited at the shop for about half an hour, and then I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police. When I talked to the officer, I found out that Melanie had been reported missing by her mother the night before. She never came back from the date. Several weeks went by, and nobody heard anything from Melanie. I continued to work at the shop, but it was incredibly difficult without her. I couldn't get my mind off of her. I was in close contact with her mother, and I was frustrated with the police, who hadn't made any progress in the case. It had been over 2 weeks and no arrests were made, so I was frustrated. Another week went by, and there was still no word about Melanie. By then, I was beyond frustrated. I had to do something, so I came up with a plan. I set up a profile on Tinder and uploaded some of my cutest photos. I remembered the face of the guy who Melanie went out with that night. I had no idea if the pictures I saw were real, but I had to try. I opened the app and started swiping. I swiped left to pass on each and every profile. I was only concerned with finding the guy who took Melanie out that night. It took an hour or so, but eventually I found what looked like the guy. It said his name was Chad, although I'm pretty sure it was Troy before. I looked through the profile for a minute, and then I swiped right. Once I did that, I put my phone away and tried to take my mind off of it. Later that day, I opened the app and I saw that I had a message from him. I felt a combination of disgust and excitement. This could be the key to finding out what happened to my friend. I replied to his message, and I'm embarrassed to say that what I typed was very provocative. I needed this guy to be interested. After a few more messages, Chad asked me out on a date, which I accepted eagerly. The next night, we met for drinks at a small bar on the other side of town. I had trouble holding back tears when I saw him sitting at a table in a far corner of the dingy room. He looked just like his pictures, which was actually surprising to me. I sat down and put on my best forced smile, but it almost caused me to dry heave. We talked for about an hour. I didn't bring up Melanie, even though it was big news in the area. As I sat there looking at this guy, I wondered what he knew. He really gave me the creeps, and I strongly suspected that he had something to do with whatever happened to Melanie. I contemplated my next step. The plan was simply to get in touch with the guy, and to be honest, I didn't expect it to work. Now that I was there, I really didn't know what to do. I kept talking to Chad, until eventually, he asked me to come back to his place. I politely declined, and then I quickly excused myself. I got up and walked out of that place as fast as I could. When I got to the street, I dialed 911. I got a hold of the detective on Melanie's case, and I explained what happened. I told him what I did, and I thought this guy was responsible for Melanie's disappearance. To my relief, the officer believed me and took it seriously. I gave Chad's information to them, and they promised to look into it. A week later, I heard that Chad was arrested and confessed to accidentally killing Melanie. He even led them to her body. I still work at the ice cream shop, but I never fully got over what happened to my friend. There's some closure in learning the truth, but it's still tough. I'm a 36-year-old guy, and this happened to me when I was 30. I had never had much success with women, probably because I'm really shy and introverted. When I was younger, I would try to go out with friends, but I was always really uncomfortable with crowds. Dance clubs are pretty much the last place that I've ever wanted to be. Because of that, it's always been very difficult for me to meet women. I'm not a bad-looking guy. I'm tall and reasonably fit. Since everyone pretty much judges others on their pictures, I felt I had an advantage. I much prefer to be judged on my looks rather than my awkward personality. I was using a dating app called OkCupid, and I was talking to a really beautiful woman named Shelly. She honestly looked like a fashion model or something. I could hardly believe she was interested in me. We talked every night for over 2 weeks, before she finally asked me to meet in real life. I suggested that we meet for dinner at a restaurant, but she invited me over to her place. That alone should have been a big red flag, but I agreed anyway. When the time came, I took the bus to the address that Shelly gave me, and when I got there, it was an older house that desperately needed work. Not exactly the kind of place I was expecting for that kind of woman. I thought it would be some kind of luxury penthouse or something like that. The place was a single story with a double-car garage. It had light blue vinyl siding with several panels missing. The roof was made of brown shingles, and they were all curled up, showing signs that they needed to be replaced. There were no lights on the house, so I was unsure whether I was in the right place. I sent a text to Shelly to make sure it was really her house. She replied right away and told me to go in through the garage. I looked over to the garage. The large door was slightly open at the bottom. There was a 3 or 4 foot opening, just enough for me to squeeze through without getting on my hands and knees. I was apprehensive, but I was really excited to meet this girl, so I walked up the driveway towards the open garage door. I stood in front of it, then I leaned down and looked in. There was one dim light in the far corner of the garage. I also noticed that there was no car. I bent down and squeezed through the gap, then I stood up and looked around. I saw a masked man standing across the room, and he was holding a knife. As soon as we locked eyes, the door started to slide down, and the man ran at me. I dropped to the ground and rolled back out of the garage, missing the automatic door by a few inches. I sprung up to my feet and ran out of there. When I was a few blocks away, there was a Dunkin' Donuts that was quite busy. When I saw the busy store, I knew I was safe. Once I had a chance to catch my breath, I decided not to go to the police. To be honest, I was really embarrassed to have fallen for that trick, and I was embarrassed to be using online dating to begin with. I know it was the wrong move, but that's what I did. About a year later, I was watching the news, and I heard that someone else had had a similar experience to me, only it didn't end as well. I know now that I could have saved somebody's life that night if I'd reported it, but I didn't, and it weighs heavily on my conscience to this day.